with sort of plain groundwork questions, and then we can go more deeply.
It's a great day. I think we are honored to have Professor Gardner in this program. And I will briefly introduce the program and why we have been doing it, and contextualize Howard Gardner's presence Antimentors. So we are, a center called Center for Neural and Cognitive Science, part of the School of Medical Sciences at the University of Hyderabad. And the University of Hyderabad is in the city of Hyderabad, and is one of India's top research universities, and now an institute of eminence, a distinct level given by the government for conducting high-end research, and aims at internationalizing our activities. Now, CogTalk is a forum that we have started since about 2 years, 3 years now, and we have been inviting very distinguished people from many fields to speak to them, who have been leaders of ideas and thoughts and who have changed disciplines. So we have had the pleasure of speaking to a lot of people, and you can visit the CogTalk website. So I think Professor Howard's acceptance is an indication of the program's success in some sense. And before I introduce Professor Gardner, I'd also like to tell that today's CogTalk is historic, because we are talking to living, and it's not always that you talk to such people and you have the privilege of their audience. So, and I'm also thankful to the audience for joining us live, and the video, an edited version of it, will be uploaded to the University of Hyderabad's YouTube channel, so that people can have a look at it and learn later, who cannot join us now. And Howard has agreed that he would indulge in a talk rather than give a talk. It's kind of a conversation. And then we have some time maybe for the audience to ask some questions. And now let me introduce, I think the name Howard Gardner is everywhere, whether you have studied psychology or not, and neuroscience or not. But I think I didn't know of him many years ago when I was doing linguistics. And I came across Howard Gardner's name with this very important book, The New Science of Mind. And I think it is a definitive historical text on the evolution of cognitive science. And then Professor Howard Gardner is currently the John H. and Elizabeth Hoff Research Professor of Cognition and Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, a renowned center of learning. And he has held many other positions at Harvard. And most importantly, has been running a project called Project Zero for about 40 years now. And also the Good Project. The name speaks for it. And I will ask Howard some questions about the project's activities later. And the honors and the list of awards that Professor Gardner has received are endless, but most importantly, the MacArthur Fellowship that is given to very few individuals for doing groundbreaking work. And he got it very early in his life. And about 30 honorary degrees by many universities across the world for his pioneering work in the area of intelligence, multiple intelligence. Although we have agreed that we won't speak about that a lot today. And more recently, the Professor Howard Gardner has written his scientific memoir. I have a book with me. I just read it some time ago. I read it just to have some ideas. And I must say that it's an excellent text in many ways. It's provocative. It gives you a good visual view of his life, and it's honest. And that's the quality we don't find often in intellectual memoirs. We find people talking about things that other people would like to hear, but Howard particularly likes to say things that he cares for. So I recommend strongly that, maybe after this talk, you buy a copy and read it. The synthesized mind is the topic of conversation. And he himself represents that in many ways that he would reveal gradually. So we will, as we are keeping the informality of today's discussion, I won't, get into nitty-gritty of theories and details or brain and other things many of you probably are studying. But would like to keep the tone more informal so that Howard educates us and tells us why he bothers about certain things that he does and what still provokes him to do scholarship, in spite having spent decades and educating many, writing many books and articles, he's still active. So it's an honor, Professor Gardner, to have you in this program. And I am very thankful that you agreed, in spite of your certainly very busy schedule, as a public speaker, as an intellectual, and a writer. I'm also thankful to Vaishnavi, who was coordinating, my PhD student and other students. And it's certainly a distinct pleasure to have you live, because of this possibility of talking to people across continents is possible now. And we are speaking at a time, not the world was coming out of COVID. We hear that today Russia is attacking Ukraine. So I am to travel to Canada on 14th of March. I don't know how the world will be. Nevertheless, so Professor Gardner, please tell us something about your beginning curiosities. I have read the book, but the audience might not have. Now, what led you to study human nature and mind in its multifarious dimensions? As a graduate student, and later on coming in contact with many luminaries, the foundation of your beginning.
All right. Well, thank you, Ramesh, for that very generous introduction. And I'm going to call you Ramesh. Please call me Howard.
Sure.
You ask a very big question about how I got involved and how I think about things. So I'm going to restrict myself to a few minutes. Otherwise, I could speak for the full hour about that. First of all, I'm glad that you mentioned the Ukraine. I'm not going to discuss it politically, but even though this is a scholarly exchange, we need to be mindful of what's happening in the rest of the world. To switch registers, what's happening in the United States and what's happening in India at the present time is very important for the rest of the world. Because 15, 20 years ago, it would have been unproblematic to describe these as the two forms of democracy in the world, one in the developed world, the United States, Western Europe, the other in the developing world, India, South Korea, Japan. But the entire political landscape has been disrupted. I don't have to name the disruptors, you know who they are. We have to hope that exchanges like this will continue and that people will be able to be honest, not aggressive, but honest about things. Fortunately, for the purpose of today, I don't think anything that I say will be particularly politically controversial. But if it was September 1st, 1939, and one didn't mention what was happening in Europe, or if it was 1947, and one didn't mention what was happening in India, one would be correctly accused of being an ostrich and having one's head in the ground. I have always been interested in human beings, more so than in animals or plants, or for that matter, the cosmos or electricity. And those are equally interesting things to be concerned about. And people spend wonderful careers and lives studying ants, like Edward O. Wilson, who just died, or atoms, like genes, like Watson and Crick. But I've always been interested in human beings, and I've been interested particularly in the human mind. And I had an uncle who was a mentor, and when I was 16, he gave me a psychology textbook. I don't think I'd ever heard of psychology. I certainly never had seen a textbook of any sort, but Uncle Fritz recognized that if I had a scholarly interest, it was in the mind. And I've approached that study from three lenses. One is human development, the development of the mind, and that's probably the longest interest of mine. I've also studied the brain, not nearly as intensively, but I spent 20 years working on a neurology ward in a hospital, and I used to joke that I was a neurologist from the neck up. I knew a lot about the brain, but not about the spinal cord or knee reflexes or things like that. And the third thing, which Ramesh mentioned, is I've been very interested in interdisciplinary studies. As a student, I studied what we might call soft social sciences, psychology, sociology, anthropology, in a field called social relations. And then, as mentioned, I wrote a book 35 years ago about the mind's new science, in which I described the several disciplines studying the mind. I'm not sure I can remember them all, but I can remember most of them: psychology, brain science, linguistics, philosophy, anthropology, and probably one other one. So that's my general intellectual background. I am an empiricist. I've run many experiments, but most of my work now is more qualitative. That is, with a team, I interview people and try to make sense of what they say. And often we use big data methods. We're not opposed to being quantitative, but I believe in the format we have today, when having people talk to one another tells you things that a survey or an experiment may not tell you. For an American, I do have more of a global perspective. I read newspapers in 5 different countries each day. I'm not by any means an expert in India, but I spent several weeks with my wife and one of my children and his wives in India in 2012 and visited many cities, including Hyderabad. And so I have a little bit more of a finger feeling for India than if I just read about it in the magazines. The one other thing I will say, which is probably slightly controversial, is I think the most important human being of the last 1,000 years was Mohandas Mahatma Gandhi. I don't say 2,000 years because I don't want to anger people who think Christ or Muhammad or Buddha or Socrates was equally important. But for the last 1,000 years, I think Gandhi was the most important. And if the planet survives, it'll be because we understand what Gandhi was trying to say and do in a way that most people in most countries have not yet understood. So I said a few minutes. I probably spoke at least 5. So that's the end of my opening comments.
Yeah, you do write about Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi, and many other people. We'll come to some influences later. So you started writing and reading quite a bit in history and other things when you were a student at the women's seminary, and that kind of is attractive because it looks to me that you got kicked into the habit of reading and synthesizing and outpouring those connected ideas pretty early on. Would you give some remembrance of those times? What we don't read in the book?
Yeah. Well, that's a really good question. And believe it or not, I was thinking about it this morning. It's morning here. When you can do something well, you assume everybody else can do it well. And this is when you're young. And when you can't do something, you assume that nobody else can do it either. So let me begin with the latter example. I have prosopagnosia. That means I cannot recognize people by their faces. I assumed that nobody could recognize people by their faces because I couldn't. On the other hand, when I was young, I had perfect pitch. So if you played a B flat on the piano, I could say that's a B flat. So I assumed everybody had perfect pitch. And the truth is, prosopagnosia is rare, and being able to recognize musical sounds is rare as well. So to get to your question, as a student, I absorbed information easily. That makes me a good student. But I was also always trying to connect the information. We might compare a quiz show contestant with a editorial writer. A quiz show contestant is somebody who can instantly answer, what's the capital of Japan? What's the biggest river in Egypt? What's the population of Brazil? But that quiz show contestant doesn't have to put that all together. An editorial writer wakes up and learns that Putin has sent troops into Ukraine. The editorial writer needs to say, what do we know about the Ukraine? What do we know about Putin? What do we know about NATO? What do we know about incursions? What do we know about oil supplies, about pipelines? So the editorial writer has to synthesize lots of information. And I've always done that easily. And maybe to criticize myself, I've been less good at being an analyst and an experimenter who can focus laser sharp for long periods of time on just one question or in just one experiment. I like to spread widely and put stuff together, and I assumed everybody else could do it as well. When I wrote the memoir, I realized that what I'm best known for, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, is a theory of multiple intelligences. But the theory of multiple intelligences doesn't explain well what my mind is like. My mind is like a typical scholar. I'm good in language, I'm good in logic, and I might be good in some other things. I'm terrible with bodily kinesthetic things. My personal intelligence is dubious, but I'm like a typical scholar. So there's nothing special about my mind in terms of intelligences, but what I do as a scholar is different than most scholars, and I'll be very specific. I studied psychology, my doctoral degree in psychology. Most psychologists do experiments, and they do dozens or hundreds of experiments. They write them up in technical journals, and if they're lucky, they get published. And if those of you who are listening are neuroscientists, you do the same thing in neuroscience. If you're computer scientists, you do the same thing in computer science. If you're a linguist, etc. I write experimental articles too, but I basically write books. I've written over 30 books, and the book is my natural means of communication. And books are, by their very nature, syntheses. If I do an experiment about how children recognize style in paintings, that was my doctoral thesis, I can write 1 or 2 articles about it. It would be absurd to write a book about it. There's not a book's worth of saying. But if somebody says to me, as they said 40 years ago, Howard, what's cognitive science? And I say, I've never heard of it. I'm going to find out about it. It wouldn't make any sense for me to find out about it and to write a short article. The natural thing is to write a book. So I hope that gives a sense both about what might be special about my mind, but also about how I might be different than most of the scholars whom you encounter if you are doing a degree in a particular discipline.
When you went to Harvard, you studied with Erik Erikson, but you also came in contact with Jerome Bruner and Nelson Goodman, a philosopher who has influenced quite many people, I think, including Chomsky. Chomsky does write about the influence of Goodman and also Roger Brown. Now, were all these people interdisciplinarian, were they conducive to your ways of thinking, or you found yourself slightly, you worked with them, but there was some difference somewhere?
Sure, that's a great question. You're reminding me that I haven't been a good student because I didn't really answer the question about Wyoming Seminary. But let me say this might be useful. Both in high school, secondary school, which was my school, a small school in Pennsylvania, and in college, and I went to Harvard College, you're encouraged to spread your interest widely. And if anything, the teachers kind of like it if you're curious and make connections. When you go into graduate school, it's very different. You're expected to come to the lab every day or to go to the library every day and go deeper and deeper into things, usually one thing, and that's what you write your thesis on, and you might spend the rest of your life on that. I was lucky enough to be in Cambridge, Massachusetts for 1961 on, so I've been there for over 60 years. And Cambridge, Massachusetts is an intellectual center. We have Harvard, we have MIT, and right nearby we have other schools less well known, but anywhere else they would be as well known, but they happen to be near Harvard and MIT. So just to give you some names, Boston College, Boston University, Tufts, Wellesley, there are many, many well-known schools in that area. So when I wanted to hear Noam Chomsky, we didn't have Zoom in those days. We didn't have laptops. I just went on the subway and went to MIT. And for Erickson and Bruner and other people, I just went to class. And I wasn't afraid to speak to them, and I wasn't afraid to challenge them. And I now realize that's incredibly unusual for an 18 or 19-year-old. And I don't think I was brash or nasty, or they would have rejected me, but I was curious, and so I would ask them questions. And someone once said to me, Howard, you have a talent for attracting mentors. Mentoring is always a two-way street. The student obviously has to find someone who they hope will teach them and help them, but the mentor doesn't spread his or her time equally among every student. They decide where to devote their mental and physical energies. And Erickson, who was a god when I was an undergraduate, was my tutor, which meant I could get to see him one-on-one, which was a very, very special experience. To go to your question, Ramesh, I was attracted to intellectuals who were synthesizers. And the three people you mentioned, Chomsky, Erickson, and Bruner, all eventually became book writers rather than article writers. Erickson never went to college. He never wrote a scholarly article in his life. He just wrote books. And the name that may be known to some of you, when I was a student of his, there was an Indian student, Sudhir Kakar, psychoanalyst. Sure. I believe he's still alive, and we knew each other. So we were both studying under Erickson's wing. Similarly, Bruner had a very, very broad mind, and he would go from one subject and one topic to another. And I had no problem following him. Chomsky did start out, that's a good distinction, actually. Chomsky started out as a linguist, writing for other linguists, very technical material, which at the time I was able to master. But by the time I was in graduate school, he'd become a political figure. I went to teach-ins where he was talking about the Vietnam War. And of course, now he's the leading public intellectual in the world. There's not even any, you might argue whether Gandhi is the most important person in the last 1,000 of years. You couldn't argue that Chomsky isn't the most important public intellectual. He already had become a book writer. And you mentioned Nelson Goodman, who is the least well-known figure. And that's because he was much more an article writer. And I'll tell a funny anecdote, and then I will turn it back to Ramesh. Some of you will know it comes from Greece, but it was made famous by Isaiah Berlin, a British intellectual. He said that some people are interested in one big thing, and we call them hedgehogs And some people are interested in lots of little things, and we call them foxes. And Nelson Goodman joked, I'm interested in one little thing. Now, that's not true. He was actually a pretty broad thinker, but he was much more an analyst than any of the other people that I mentioned. And he took me under his wing because I wasn't a philosopher. If I'd been a philosopher, he would have naturally taken an oppositional approach to me, because he would have tried to poke holes in my article, but in my arguments. But because I was a psychologist interested in the brain, he could learn something from me, and we had much more of a father-son kind of relationship. So for students, this is not an American issue. This is not a European issue. It's not an Indian issue. It's not a Chinese issue. It says, whom do you learn from? Whom do you identify with? Whom would you like to have mentor you? And I write in my memoir, mentors are wonderful, but we also have tormentors and anti-mentors. Tormentors are what Nelson Goodman would have been if I decided to become a philosopher. He would have tried to poke holes in my argument. Anti-mentors, I describe one in my book. He's actually very well known to psychologists and even to the general public, though not by his name, Stanley Milgram. Stanley Milgram did incredibly important work in the 1960s, and most of you will remember the study because it's called Obedience to Authority. And what Stanley Milgram showed in very clever experiments, that if you bring someone to a psychological lab, and you have a person, usually a man with a white coat, and the man with the white coat says, this is an experiment, and you have to deliver shocks, even shocks which could be very hurtful to the subject, you need to do that. And the psychological world was astonished, because most people in most countries would continue delivering the shock, not because they wanted to harm somebody, but because the experimenter, who was an authoritative figure, said the experiment must go on. Milgram was a brilliant experimenter, but he decided to become a public tormentor of mine. And I write about it in the book, and it was very painful. He attacked me publicly, and nobody came to my defense. That probably toughened me up, but he wasn't shooting a bow and arrow with me, but he was trying to make me humiliate me in public. So he was an anti-mentor or tormentor. And interestingly, Stanley Milgram, who was a brilliant scholar, didn't get tenure at Harvard. Tenure means that you can teach until you're ready to retire. And I was wondering whether he didn't get tenure at Harvard because he was a tormentor or an anti-mentor. So I asked to see the tenure files, and I asked the head of the archives, and I asked the head of the college, and finally the head of the arts and sciences. And the answer is, the archives are closed until 60 years after the decision is made. So if I live to 102, I can read Stanley Milgram's tenure file, but otherwise I'm out of luck. And then the information might not be in there.
Okay, so I saw you told from, you might have seen an extended interview by William Buckley and Chomsky talking about Vietnam War, when you must have been there. Do you remember that? William Buckley and Chomsky talking about the interview with Chomsky on particularly in Vietnam War and sort of targeting him.
The answer is, I have done several public interviews of Chomsky, and I have read many of his things about Vietnam War, because he wrote a very, very famous article called The Responsibility of the Intellectuals, a very important article for everybody listening. I wouldn't say intellectuals, the responsibility of the scholar and the teacher. But I don't remember discussing myself with Vietnam issues, but of course, it was a wake-up call for the United States, people who were willing to listen. And of course, with what's going on in the Ukraine now, I think we can say that the United States does not have an unblemished an unblemished reputation in dealing with other countries. For most of the United States history, we have thought of many places as being in our sphere of influence, particularly, of course, Latin America, but the Philippines. And while we had no pretense of taking over Vietnam ourselves, we felt that we should choose one side and defend it, or probably more accurately, what Chomsky would say, no American president wanted to say they'd lost a war, and so they announced that Vietnam was an American war, and they had to live with the consequences. And many people, including me, don't have the courage to speak up in the way that Chomsky did, and that's why he's admired by most of the people whom I know. Of course, there are people who think that he's destructive.
Howard, you were at Harvard when the Society of Fellows was coming into existence. That sort of led to cognitive science. Chomsky and Miller and other people, many others from Europe, William Levels and so on. So did you also have a chance to talk to Skinner and figures like Leonard Bloomfield? You don't write at all about them in your memoir.
Yes, I'm smiling. I knew Skinner somewhat. We would be in the elevator together. We had a perfectly proper communication. But actually, the reason I'm smiling is in 1989, my wife and son and I bought a house right near the house of Skinner. And so we would see Skinner on taking a walk, and sometimes Ellen and I and our son Benjamin would walk with him, and it was very pleasant, and he was quite avuncular. He liked to be nice to children, but he used to mutter, "Oh, you cognitivists, you'll never understand what human psychology is really like." Now I can step back with the vantage of time and distance, and I think Skinner was a brilliant experimentalist and had real insights into how all organisms, including human beings, learn and behave. I mean, Skinner gives a better explanation of gambling and variable ratio reinforcement than anybody else. I think that Chomsky is much too much of a rationalist and a computationalist and doesn't pay nearly enough attention to social and contextual matters. I think in my book about cognitive science, I mentioned that at MIT, they had pencils with the legend, "Context sucks." Context sucks means we want to ignore constants and get rid of. And of course, if you're working with computers, you can get rid of context. But if you're working with human beings, you can't. So, well, I don't think there's ever going to be a synthesis of Chomsky and Skinner. I think now, being much older, I see more of the limitations of the Chomskyan approach and more of the brilliance of the Skinnerian approach. And both Jerome Bruner, who was a mentor, and Roger Brown, less well known, who was my thesis advisor, were people who were not particularly polemicists. They would study something and move on to something else. They would put a stake in the ground, and if people criticized it, fine, and people built on it, fine. But we didn't enjoy battles. And the other people who I mentioned, Chomsky, Skinner, and Goodman loved battles. And again, for students, that's interesting thing to bear in mind. People who were attracted to Roger Brown, when Roger Brown was attracted to them, tended to be more people who wanted to understand something and move on, were people who were attracted to Skinner and Chomsky and Goodman were often more conflict friendly. They like to attack and they like to show the fatal flaw. And a name who many of psychologists will know, Steven Pinker. He's probably the best known American popularizer of psychology and a very good writer and a friend of my wife's and mine. He studied both with Chomsky and Brown, Roger Brown, and he's a very interesting combination because Pinker doesn't at all shy away from conflict, but on a personal level, he's quite open and friendly, and he doesn't start fights, but he doesn't run away from them either. So that's another dimension of human beings, is to what extent do they like to be in the ring? And of course, I didn't know Gandhi, but the other day I watched for the 10th time the movie of Gandhi, where Ben Kingsley plays Gandhi. You probably have all seen that movie. And Ben Kingsley captures perfectly the softness and the toughness of Gandhi. Gandhi could be tough as nails. He could sleep in a bed of nails, but he could be soft and gentle, particularly for people who didn't have anybody else to defend him. And those people, and I would call Gandhi a saint in a technical sense, they're often not good family members. They're not necessarily good husbands, good wives, or good friends. And a friend of Gandhi once said to him, whatever he called him, Mohandas, how can you worry about your son? Your work is so much more important. And that's probably what Gandhi thought. But I think people like that are better off if they don't have children, because I have 4 children, 5 grandchildren. I try to do my best. They can and should criticize me. That's part of being a Western family, is that we're much more open to criticism. But if you take your children and your grandchildren seriously, it's hard to save the world at the same time. I don't know, Ramesh, whether this was has become known in the press in India, but 2 days ago, the human being whom I know, who's closest to being a saint, died. That's Dr. Paul Farmer. He died in Rwanda.
Yeah.
And
I did
you'll be reading. You'll be reading about him.
Yeah.
Because this, I don't know anything about his personal life, and it's none of my business. But this person was interested in saving hundreds, thousands, millions of lives around the world, and was fearless.
There was an NYT New York Times editorial with the title, "He wanted to be a doctor to everyone." And
that's right. Tracy Kidder, who wrote his biography, wrote that.
Howard, you seem to be pretty much into Gandhi. Would you call him an assimilator of ideas? He was a lawyer, and he moved to South Africa, and he got exposed to brutal racism, and he opened a farm and started reading Tolstoy. He comes to India, and that's the kind of story, and then understands India from a different point of view altogether, because that was not the India he had left. And the great writer V.S. Naipaul writes eloquently about fictionalizes, but I think pretty much. So do you think that the readings of Gandhi and the assimilatory possibilities, because he understood early probably that it's not a straightforward path to free a country of millions of people that have divergent worldviews, and at the time literacy in India was not that good, and there were many other problems that still remain. So have you gone into that direction of understanding why? Sort of like.
Well, I think that that any positive descriptor that you give to Gandhi, I would be inclined to accept. I think he was an extraordinary person with an extraordinary mind. Erik Erikson was a psychoanalyst, and he said 60 years ago, Gandhi psychoanalyzed the Indian nation, by which he meant understood, or the Indian, I don't know whether you want to call it nation, the Indian subcontinent. He understood the strains, the aspirations, the problems, and the possible solutions better than anybody else of his time. But I think that I would completely agree with the implication that if Gandhi just stayed throughout his life as a barrister in India and had never traveled to England, where he was exposed to the good and bad of empire and the good and bad of democracy and of constitutional law and so on. If he then hadn't gone to South Africa, which was kind of an exaggeration of all the bad features of England and probably not many of the good features, he would never have been able to accomplish what he wanted to. What I understand much less well than experts is to what extent his knowledge of Indian history and prehistory, of Hindu culture, of Muslim culture, of the caste system, to what extent of the agricultural and the tremendous variety of climates. I mean, how he put that all together is, that wouldn't have happened unless he had made the life choices he had. And of course, his parents had to allow him to leave India. He couldn't just say, well, I'm going to London tomorrow, I'm going to Cape Town next week. He had to have support. But your question takes me back to what we're supposed to be talking about today, is that there are two different kinds of synthesizers. And I think Gandhi combined them. The synthesizers I know the most about are people who are kind of intellectual synthesizers. We take ideas and we put them together, and maybe in ways which are useful. And certainly Nelson Goodman, who isn't well known, was an intellectual synthesizer. I think Jerome Bruner as well, certainly Roger Brown. But there also are people who synthesize in action. They're activist synthesizers. And they may or may not write anything. They may or may not be good speakers, but they're able to accomplish something in the world. And often political leaders or business leaders, and of course there are many business leaders in India, and a lot of them are now in Silicon Valley, they're synthesizing information about the world of production, finance, management, and so on. I know much less about that world, but that's a kind of synthesis. I call it synthesis in action as opposed to synthesis in thought. I mean, if I were to interview Elon Musk, he may or may not be able to give me a good account of how he synthesizes, but certainly by watching him and studying him, I would get a lot of insight into that. Nelson Goodman, you have to read his work to understand how he synthesizes. It's in his words, in his writing. And this will mean something to those of you who are somewhat older. Most academics, when they reach the age of 40 or so, they have to decide, do they want to be a scholar or do they want to be an administrator? An administrator means become a dean or a president or a head of department, or do they want to keep writing books and articles? And if you're like me and you're just a synthesizer in thought, you don't want to run anything. And so you don't accept those positions. If you kind of have written what you're going to write and you're going to be bored writing again, then you want to become a person who can influence things. The one exception with Ramesh mentioned is that for actually 55 years, I've been at a place called Project Zero, which is a research center at Harvard. And for half of that time, I was the co-director of it. And I'm still now the senior director. I have some other title for old people, but that's a research group that works all over the world in education. When I was in India, I went to the Riverside School in Ahmedabad, which is run by Kiran Sethi, who's a great educational innovator. And our host in India was Ashish Rajpal, who started several educational ventures in India, which I think are still going, though he's moved on to work in other parts of the world. And these are people who may or may not write well, but they're people who achieve things in action. And so that's a decision point that most scholars will reach. And of course, nowadays in the United States, it's harder to get a job as a scholar than it used to be for many reasons. And so many people, even when they have a doctoral degree, have to do their synthesizing working for Google or for Elon Musk or for Chase Manhattan Bank or for Tati or Tata or some other multinational conglomerate.
Okay, let's stay on this topic for some time. So it seems like that synthesizing is some sort of a natural, inherent instinct of humans. They always have done it. But probably more recently, the world seems like it's specialized because it awards or rewards specialization. But synthesizing has always been there. People have been interested in other things than what they have studied. But there has lately, in many parts of the world, it's not because of the specialized nature of jobs and career progress structures and many other things. So what's your view on, is it some acquired tendency or it is present in everyone? It's a matter of just expressing it in finding the right environment.
Well, I'm going to answer that question while I also answer another question, which you said at the beginning. I am now obsessed with synthesizing, and I think about it from morning till night. I actually got 2 ideas this morning on my walk, which is good as long as they weren't ideas I had before, just forgot. I don't think I'm quite that senile yet. No, I quote a line from a French play. A man my age says, "I've been speaking prose all my life and I never knew it." And that's supposed to be funny because, of course, we all talk, but we may not know the term prose, P-R-O-S-E, which just means extended discourse. So yeah, we synthesize all the time. If I decide to do what to do on the weekend, then I have various possibilities. I rank order them, and I decide to do 1 or 2 of them, and I might try to join them. That's synthesis. Or if I'm planning a meal, so it's something we do all the time and we take for granted. I would call that little s synthesis. I'm interested in big S synthesis. I'm interested in what Charles Darwin did when he came up with the theory of evolution. I'm interested in, you may know Yuval Harari, this Israeli writer who writes about Homo sapiens. I'm interested in big S synthesis when people take a lot of information and put it together in a way that's compelling and say, my goodness, I never thought about things in that way before. And an interesting question is being creative the same as being a synthesizer? And I would say no. You can write a wonderful textbook in a field, and it can be a highly synthetic work. It can bring lots of things together, but it's not highly creative. Other people could do it too. There are also some discoveries which are kind of one-shot things, and they can be highly creative. There are even some artists who've only done one work that's really creative, and those I would not describe as synthesizers. You might say they're lucky, or they had one thing that they were obsessed with. There's a French composer, Eric Satie, or actually the Italian composer Vivaldi. Vivaldi wrote 1,000 pieces, but they all sound pretty much the same to me. So I wouldn't say he was a great synthesizer. Scarlatti wrote 500 sonatas for the piano, and they're actually different from one another. I've studied them, so he gets more of credit for that. But yeah, no, to get to the nub of your question, we live in a world now that almost anything that can be laid out in an algorithm, we can get computers to do fit faster and better than we can. So synthesis might be kind of the last holdout. We can't really say, what's going on now in Russia, in the Ukraine, at the United Nations, in Poland, and in Lithuania, and what's going on in China, and what does President Xi think of Putin, and will Trump become president? We can't feed that into a computer and say, what's the most likely thing to happen there? So that calls not for a single person, obviously, but for many minds working together. And I know India has many centers which bring together people who have different kinds of expertise. In India, you're a failure as a parent if your child doesn't decide to become an engineer. That's sort of a joke, but a lot of stuff which in the United States would be in other departments, like an education department or a medical department would be in an engineering school or one of your tech schools, but they're much broader than it would be in the United States. And people with synthesizing minds are attracted to those kinds of places. And here we talk about administrators, good administrators bring people like that to their schools. Remember, we were talking about this man, Erik Erikson, who was my teacher and the teacher of Sudhir Kalkar. He would never have gotten tenure at Harvard from a department, but there was a good administrator, Ramesh may actually know his name, George Bundy. He became less well known because of his role in the Vietnam War. He said, Erik Erikson is very special. I'm going to make him a professor. And that's what an administrator with power and good taste can do. We all know what administrators with power and bad taste do. They can destroy an institution.
I think something similar happened to you. You walked into the dean's office and almost demanded a job. Is not it true that you're right? You almost got a job by demanding that I deserve a job when you were tenure at Harvard.
It's funny because I know the anecdote you're referring to, and my wife and I are having lunch with that person and her husband today.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but I not to demystify it. After I finished graduate school, I didn't have a job, and that was partly by my choice. I lived off of grants, which you could do in the United States. You apply for funds from the government or from a foundation, and then you raise your own salary. But I was getting to be middle-aged. I had children, and they needed to go to college. That's very expensive in the United States. So when I won this prize, I went into my dean and said in a nice way, you know, when the prize ends, I either want to have a job here or I want to go looking for a job elsewhere. And she was much cleverer than the faculty, because I think the faculty was not inclined to hire me. And we could talk endlessly about why that's the case. But the Roger Brown, whom I mentioned before, the man who was my advisor and my wife's advisor for doctorate work, said to me, Howard, you're going to have to be a chimney appointment. And I said, what is a chimney appointment? He said, from the top down, meaning somebody in a position of power should say, you ought to hire this person. And I think even people at my school who don't love me would think that hiring me wasn't a mistake, that it was probably the right thing to do. But academics are very territorial. When Skinner retired, he wanted someone to replace him, a man named Herrnstein, and Herrnstein did. So that's very non-American, it's very European, and it's very Asian, namely the boss gets to decide who the successor is. That's one good feature about the United States. We're less likely to do that. Though if Mr. Trump had his way, there'd be Trumps in office for the next 100 years.
All right, so I would like to give you an example from the Indian system that sort of exposes how synthesizing is not practically sometimes you might have obviously the Indian Institute of Technologies that Government of India, Nehru first established them with Ford Foundation's money, and now we have 30 of them, and many technocrats that have emerged in India or have made great wealth in America are graduates of IITs. And many of them, they do go to Harvard and MIT to do further research. Mridang Kasoor, the neuroscientist, comes to my mind, is one of them. Now, there are humanity and social science departments in all these 30 IITs, but strangely, as one would not expect, many of the times they are sort of told to design courses or teach courses that are in alignment with the engineering students' other courses. So it's not that they really can offer whatever they feel like offering. I think in pretty much contrast to MIT or Caltech, where Chomsky would just write anything he wants. So because that sort of a thing is absent in India, and I can go on record in telling this pretty openly, because I think that.
Yeah, let me talk a bit about that, and then I have to unfortunately conclude because I need to do some other things today. But I really enjoyed this discussion. I've been very fortunate, extremely fortunate in almost every respect, because my parents were Jews who lived in Germany and escaped just in time. And I grew up in the United States at a time when the country was expanding and really saw no limits, and I was fortunate to get a excellent education, which I took full advantage of, and to have managed to reach a very old age without too many body blows. And if I have body blows, they may be deserved. So I'm not a particularly good role model for a different time, even in the United States, and certainly in a time of pandemics and of climate change, which is not going to stop just because we want it to stop. It's only going to stop if the countries in the world decide it has to stop. That said, what we attend to and what we spend time on are our own decisions. That doesn't mean we don't have to work. We do have to work. It doesn't mean that if we have children or a spouse that we don't have to pay attention to them. And that's why I said that saints like Gandhi are probably better off not having families. But I'm going to use an example which would make almost all American young people very uncomfortable. How much time do you spend on your device? And how much time do you spend on Facebook and places that I haven't heard of? Tinder, gossiping, looking at other people, being jealous, shooting photographs, and so on. The decisions you make on how you spend your time and what you do are much more your own than you may think. And most people waste much, much more time than they should on stuff that's not necessary for what's important to you. So I think even if I'd had to work in a bookstore to make a living, I could have still pursued the interests that I did and written about them. And if I wanted to see Noam Chomsky, I might have had an easier time than if I was a professor, because he always was nicer to people from bookstores than the people who were in the same department. That's not fair, but you get the idea. And we have in the United States now a category called independent scholar, which sometimes is because you can't get a job, but sometimes it is because you would rather make money on a job that you like or that you can make enough money on than teaching at a place that you don't want to. Probably the greatest English poet of the 20th century, T.S. Eliot, had a full-time job, as did Wallace Stevens, one of the great American poets, and Charles Ives, a great American composer. So it's really a question of how you use your time. And you should use your time for what you like to do. I play the piano every day for an hour. I'm a terrible pianist, but to me, it's restorative. It's almost religious. It's like a ritual. And nobody should, until my fingers get arthritis, I'm going to keep doing that. And when I can stop being able to do it, I will at least listen to Mozart and play it in my own mind, or Ravi Shankar. And so the advice I would give is, certainly you should try to do what you want to do and try to find the career line that you most like. And if, like me, you're lucky and the dean loves you, you might get the job that you want to have. But even if you don't, there's lots of time, and you don't have to work alone. One of the wonderful things about the internet is you can work with thousands of people all around the world on the same issues. And sometimes the structure of a protein is solved not by an individual chemist, but by 40 people in 40 different countries looking at the variations, and maybe we could even say synthesizing the protein. So my advice is guard your time carefully, decide what's really important, and get to that first in the day, not last. So I mentioned this morning on my walk at 7 a.m., I had two ideas about synthesis. If I'd waited till the night when I was exhausted, because I have several meetings today, I would have probably fallen asleep or watched some stupid movie. So if you monitor your time and you keep your priorities right, you may be pleasantly surprised about what you accomplish and even how well you accomplish it. And you should look for mentors who can help you with that, because all the people I mentioned, and unfortunately, they were all men, because in those days, there were almost no women doing these things, but I wish I had women, and certainly my dean was a woman, and Suzanne Langer my philosophy teacher was a woman, and I write about them in my book. Look for your mentors in all different kinds of places, but look for people that help you use your time wisely and use their time wisely themselves. So with that, as I say, I appreciate the chance to talk with you. I'm sorry if I couldn't touch on all the issues. Ramesh, if there are a couple of things that are important and you write to me, I'll share them with you and you can share them with the audience as you see fit.
Sure. I think that we cannot go any further, though it would be endlessly entertaining to talk to him, but I think we have to stop here. And
Okay.
the audience, if they have any questions, and there's no way that you won't find our Gardner on the internet. So please write to us, and the video when we after.
Now let me just say, Ramesh, I have a good website, howardgardner.com.
Excellent website. I was about to talk about you. That website is mind blowing, and the blogs are fascinating. And
thank you. Yeah. So that's a good place to go, because don't write to me and say, what's the theory of multiple intelligences? Because we'll write and say, look at multiple intelligences oasis. Okay.
So I think we have learned quite a bit, and a lot of advice we certainly give. And I think it's an important talk today, and we are grateful. And if I pass by the United States, and I would certainly like to meet Howard in person, or maybe I don't know, if time situations to invite to India. But I encourage everyone to read some of his books, because as he said, the books are his territory. There he is very expansive, and any amount of interview cannot extract all of that. So I think with this, we are very grateful, Professor Gardner, for your time. And
thank you for your efforts, Ramesh.
We have a great dinner, and here in India it's about to be late evening, and we have started curating the important people that we have talked to, sort of a photograph of them. With us, and they put that link signed by them. So there's a Hall of Fame of for generations of students to come, whom we were talking to. And so maybe Vaishnavi will coordinate that with you, with your signature sent back to, and so that we hang your picture here with other people that we have talked to in this program.
Okay,
that's sort of a return gift. So we can't give you anything, but we have you here, so that people know that they develop a synthesized mind. There are many important questions that could have come up of digital life and the impact of modern technology on mind in good life. Probably you are interested in all of them, but we cannot get to all of that. Thanks everyone, the audience, Vaishnavi and the coordinators, and Professor Gardner. It was a nice
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks. Bye.